Well, I think, whether or not you're, 12 or 40 years old, I don't think many of us would look at a spreadsheet full of data and get a buzz of excitement about what that data could be showing us. So
James would, by the way.
Yeah. Is this you dodging doing some ballet on the podcast for this, Ben? Come on, I want to see your routine.
I can if you want to.
Yeah. Welcome to Hello World, a podcast for educators interested in computing and digital making. I'm James Robinson, a content creator for the Raspberry Pi Foundation, specialising in computing pedagogy. As Carrie-Anne is away taking a well-earned break, today I'm fortunate to have another amazing educator stepping in to join me as co-host for this episode.
That's a lovely introduction. Hi, I'm Rebecca Franks, a learning manager for the Raspberry Pi Foundation, specialising in secondary computing education, which is 11 to 16-year-olds. If you want to support our show, then subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a 5-star review.
It's great to have you with me, Rebecca, today. We've got some fantastic guests coming up. Today, we're asking, how do we engage our learners in data science? Understanding data has always been an important skill, but in particular now as data is all around us and we interact with it in so many parts of our lives. Developing our learners' data literacy is an important part of modern education, but why should they care and how do we best support them? Rebecca, I'm afraid it's time to put you on the spot. So first of all, what do you think we mean when we talk about data science and data literacy, and how do we make it relevant for our learners?
Okay, well, I would say that data science deals with the collection of data through many different means and finding the value in that data. And that value can be found through many different forms, but the most common would be a data visualization, which isn't always what we would traditionally call a graph that we might have produced in our maths or science lessons at school, but it can be so much more than that. And I am sure we will learn more about that from our guests as well. Then I would say that being data literate means having the tools to look at the data that is presented to us and question its validity. And I feel that nowadays we are exposed to so many facts and figures in the news and on social media that it is becoming really hard to see the facts behind the fiction. And by developing our data literacy skills, we can learn to look at the source of the data, the representative samples that were used, and also the ethics, which is really important, behind the data collection in the first place. And this can help us to make more informed decisions in our day-to-day lives.
I think I agree with you in terms of that explanation of data. I think it's really important. And as you say, it's all around us. And we want our learners, our citizens of the future, to be able to consume data critically, to be able to make up their own mind based upon the data that they are being presented with, and to be able to see through data that is perhaps being used to convince them or persuade them, where maybe actually it's not being used as well as it could be. And you mentioned visualization, and I'm sure, as you say, we're going to hear from our guests, but I think one of my favourite books, and I haven't got it off my it's like a coffee table book. I haven't picked it up and looked at it for a while. It's called Information is Beautiful, and it is a really fantastic book. And I think they've done an updated version where they take lots of big data sets and they visualize it and demonstrate it in really interesting and innovative ways. And for me, that just sort of really kind of shows the power of visualization for data. So I think tapping into the data that matters to our learners will help encourage them to be excited about data and see the value in being data literate. And to help us explore this question further, we're joined by two fantastic guests who between them have ample experience teaching and writing about data science. Our first guest is Simon Johnson, teacher, author and Raspberry Pi certified educator and host of CasChat, a regular computing education focused Twitter chat. Simon recently wrote an article about contextualizing data science for issue 16 of Hello World magazine. Simon, welcome. And what for you, where does data science fit into the computing curriculum?
First of all, thank you for having me on. It's an honour. With regard to your question, I think at its heart, data science is about solving problems. So the ability to think analytically and to recognise patterns are key components of computational thinking. Also, if you think about data science, you're using algorithms to extract knowledge, to understand data and unstructured data. But as we will talk more about, it also helps to provide a context to many of the concepts that we teach. I'd like to go back to what Rebecca was saying or alluding to about visualization. I think one of the problems with the computing curriculum is that there is, this is sound a bit silly, but there's too much focus on the computing side.
And so what does that mean in practice, Simon? When we talk about what steps can, when we talk about giving students context, what do we mean by that? What steps can educators take to give their content more relevance to their learners? And believe me, I know all about this. I'm a trained maths teacher, and why are we learning this was a very frequent question, particularly with abstract concept in maths. So yeah, what can educators do, Simon?
I completely agree. I feel for maths teachers sometimes. I remember asking my teacher, why are we doing Pythagoras? When am I going to use Pythagoras in the rest of my life? I'd start by asking yourself a couple of questions, key questions. And by answering those questions, you can help your students relate to the subject. So the first question would be, does this relate to students' aspirations or common interests? And I'll kind of answer these questions myself in a moment. The second one is, does it involve skills that I can use in the workplace or the students can use in the workplace? And finally, can it be linked to popular culture? So if we look back at the first question, does this relate to students' aspirations or common interests? There's a bit of controversy about this and about using students' aspirations and interests in subjects. So there's kind of two ways of thinking about this. The first is a student-centered or student-centric approach, and the other one is contextualization. I used to do a lot of PBL. So if you've not used PBL are big in the States. It's quite popular in the UK as well.
What does that mean for our listeners? What does PBL mean?
So PBL is project-based learning, and it's one of these approaches that covers multiple disciplines. And the idea is students work on a project, so they have a project manager. They have to research a topic, and then they'll just create a design, and then they'll pitch their idea, very similar to like Dragon's Den. And as well as focusing on the topic, the students are assessed on their collaboration skills, team skills, all that, listening skills. And it's usually focused on an interest. Another example is Genius Hour. So Genius Hour came from big companies like Google, where they'd give their employees a day in the week where they could work on their own project, their own passions, and things like, I think it was Google Docs came out of Genius Hour. So a lot of schools have took on this idea where students can then, on a Friday afternoon, possibly work on a project that interests them. The problem with that approach is, and I used to do this when teaching Photoshop, I say, right, this week we're going to do Photoshop and you're going to create a album cover of your favorite artist. And I find that the children would spend half the time actually just finding pictures of the artist rather than focusing on the skills. Whereas with a contextualization, you're using something that's relatable to the students. So, for example, if you're working on a project on creating infographics, you could use mobile phone habits. So get the students to interview each other, ask each other about how they use their mobile phones, whether it's for gaming, for watching video, or actual texting. Who uses their phone for texting anymore? But then use that and create data visualization. So you're using something that they can relate to, but they're not going to focus too much on that interest. The other question to ask yourself is, does it involve skills that I can use in the workplace? I love this quote. When I grow up, I want to be a data scientist, said no child ever. But a recent report by LinkedIn, I think it was a 2020 Emerging Jobs report, highlighted that data science roles were starting to appear across almost every industry, and it's one of the biggest growing sectors. To give you some examples, a few seasons ago, Liverpool Football Club won the Premier League, and they went on this really magnificent unbeaten run. And a lot of that was owed to data science. So they actually employed mathematicians and data scientists to analyze the players and the style of play and try to predict how and where best to place players in certain situations to get better outcomes, which is quite interesting. And students are not aware of this. Ask yourself, can it be linked to popular culture? So a lot of people are probably already aware that data analytics and data science and AI is involved in things like Netflix. So whenever you watch a video on or film on Netflix, it will take that data to decide what other shows to purchase based on popularity or to commission, or also give you ideas or links or suggestions on what to watch.
That's really interesting, Simon. You've given us loads of ways to contextualise it already. That's really, really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots to think about there. I think it's probably time to bring in our second guest. So also with us today is Ben Garside, a former secondary teacher who develops learning materials here at the Raspberry Pi Foundation. Ben wrote the secondary data science units for the teacher computing curriculum, as well as a recent article entitled Data Visualizations for Inquisitive Minds, which was in issue 16 of the Hello World magazine. So Ben, same question, but with a follow-up to you. So where does data science fit into the computing curriculum? And why do you think visualization is a powerful way to engage our learners?
Where the data science fits into the curriculum is an interesting question, because if you were to look at our English national curriculum program of study, interestingly, there's no mention of data science anywhere. So what I thought I'd do when I found that out, I thought I'm just going to go to find what a definition for data science is. So I did what everybody does and went straight to Wikipedia. So Wikipedia says data science is an interdisciplinary field that uses scientific methods, processes, algorithms to extract knowledge from noisy, structured and unstructured data to gain actionable insights. So actually, when you look at those terms, there's a lot of common computing terms in there. And if you look at what the outcomes are for, actually the English national curriculum, is that we want our students to be able to analyze problems, to be able to use abstraction, logic, algorithms, apply information technology to solve problems, and be responsible and creative users of information communication technology. So I think whether or not you're a teacher in England or anywhere else in the world, all of these are, these common computing terms that together, I think, encompass all the skills required to be a data scientist. So it's about analyzing data to solve problems, or collect and preparing data, analyzing it possibly by using algorithms in order to provide insights. So I suppose where it fits into the curriculum is that it's whenever students start learning about computing. I mean, younger children can be taught that there are fundamental differences between data and information. They could take a really simple project of collecting data, doing some analysis on it, and just finding a different way to present that data from its raw format. And then, of course, as children progress throughout school, I think these skills can be developed further by looking at larger data sets, or exploring maybe how programming can fit into this, how to use programming to clean data or analyze and present it, or explore how it relates to other things such as machine learning and artificial intelligence. And as mentioned earlier by, I think, Rebecca, I think it's really important aspect of data science that shouldn't be overlooked is that kind of impact on society and its responsible use, making people aware that the data is being collected by a bunch of companies and it might be providing insights, sometimes with the benefit to you. So if you've got like a step counter on your smartwatch or a mobile phone, it provides you with insights, which is great because that's going to help your fitness levels. But what about when those insights aren't for you, like a social media company who collects data about their users, and how are they analyzing the data, and who's actually going to benefit from the insights it's providing? In my opinion, given all of that, I think the grounding for data science definitely lies within computing. But I think it's been touched on by Simon. It's not just a remit of computer science. For example, how much data would a geographer or a scientist work with on a daily basis? What insights to an historical event can a historian provide if they're equipped with these data science skills? So I think it fits very comfortably within computing, and shouldn't just be seen as a computing skill alone.
I read your article about data visualizations, and I really love fascinating ways to visualize data. And one of my absolute favorite is Genevieve with Ready Salted Code, where she took some data about storms that happen and she turned it into a ballet to make such an amazing way to look at how storms do, but through a ballet. So can you top that, Ben? Can you top that with anything for me?
I can't top it with any visualizations that I've made, but that is a really great example, yeah. And I think what that
is this you dodging doing some ballet on the podcast for us, Ben? Come on, I want to see your routine.
I can if you want to.
Yeah.
If only a visual for the listeners. Well, I think, whether or not you're, 12 or 40 years old, I don't think many of us would look at a spreadsheet full of data and get a buzz of excitement about what that data could be showing us. So I think that by the very nature of that sentence means that...
James would, by the way.
Maybe some of the mathematicians might. Yeah. But yeah, so I think we're trying to engage students. We need to keep that in mind, right? So that being said, the way I kind of like to introduce it is I would love to be able to show somebody like just raw data and then the visualization of that data and get them to see the difference between them. I think that can be really powerful. So you talked about an example there, Rebecca. One of my favorite examples, which I mentioned in the article, is this really famous visualization. It's created by a French engineer called Charles Joseph Mignard, and I wrote this down. It was in 1869, and by trade he was known for creating information graphics by hand, because that was way before any technology could produce any kind of fancy computer generated visualizations. But what he did is took data known about Napoleon's march on Russia in 1812 and turned that into a visualization. And I really like the idea of giving the students this data, this raw data about that, and saying, look, what information, can you get any meaning from this raw data? And they might be able to tell you some things about it, but then you show them the visualization and ask them to do the same thing. What meaning can you get from this? And all of a sudden they can do more. I mean, from the raw data, you can see that you get an understanding that lots of troops are lost. Now, I think if you already knew about Napoleon's march on Russia, I think you probably could have guessed that anyway. But when you look at the visualization, it's like a line graph kind of look. It's not a line graph, but there are two lines, and one of them, it represents in one color the march on Moscow, and the other line is a different color, and it represents the retreat. And the thickness of the lines represents the size of the army. And like when you see that, you think, wow! All of a sudden, like the scale of the losses just becomes really clear. I think he set off with something like 400,000 troops and came back with 10,000 troops. Now, if I told you that, you think, well, that's quite a lot that they've lost. But when you see that visualized, you really get like an understanding of what scale that loss was and where it took place. And I've actually heard that visualization being described as the Mona Lisa of visualizations, because the more you look at it, the more you see. There's temperatures on there showing just how much colder it got as they approached Moscow. There's geographical features on there showing, towns, cities, rivers. And actually, the river thing is really significant, because you can see that on a certain day, they started with 50,000 troops. And then by the time they crossed the river, the troop numbers dropped to 28,000. So showing they'd lost 22,000 men. So whilst the geographical coordinates were available in the data, you don't know where those rivers were until you see that visualization, understand how significant it is. What I like about that one alone is that the visualization tells a story. It's not just raw data on a sheet. It's not just an image. It's not an illustration. It's something that actually tells a story. And I also like the other visualization in my article as well, which is why I wrote about it, by a man named Jon Snow. And if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, it's definitely not that Jon Snow. He did know something. So what he did is he mapped out cholera deaths on something called a dot map. Essentially what he did is he took a street map of the Soho area in London, and he placed a dot at the location of where someone lived who had died of cholera. What I really like about the visualization is that a lot of people at the time thought that cholera was caused by dirty, polluted air in London. But what Jon Snow believed is that it was being caused by the water supply. So he wasn't creating the visualization to discover this, but he was actually using the visualization to prove he was right. So the visualization shows that the death was centered around this pump on a street called Broad Street, and where the local residents got their water from. So he made it into a visualization, and he took it to the local council in order to convince them that this was the case. It proved the theory, and as a result, they shut down the water pump and saved lives. I think both of those examples, I find them really engaging. I hope the students would too, because it makes them realize the power of visualization in comparison to just looking at raw data. The fact that, you can tell a story, you can gain these insights into it. And importantly, you can persuade people to take action. Ultimately, I think a visualization can bring data to life.
That's a really great and very comprehensive answer. Thank you, Ben. I think you talking there reminds me a little bit about how we started the show. I think Rebecca was talking about value and meaning and sort of extracting value and meaning. And I think that's a really key part of producing visualizations, is being able to convey that meaning, tell that story. And there's so many skills wrapped up here, because you need students to be able to not only, if they're creating visualizations, they need to understand the data, they need to think about all the different ways. There's some creativity within that kind of creating of visualizations. But then you also want them to be able to work with other people's visualizations and interpret that and understand and draw conclusions from it. So I think these are really important skills that we're touching upon here. You mentioned the Jon Snow example. Am I right in thinking that that's part of one of the units in the Teach Computing curriculum?
That's absolutely right. It is definitely in there. So that unit starts off by talking about different visualizations, getting them to understand that it's not visualizations, don't have a particular form. I think if you were to say to a student take data and make it visual, I think a lot of them might go, right, okay, I'm going to make a bar chart or a line chart or something like that. So I think what I want them to get an understanding of in that unit is the fact that visualizations can take pretty much any form. You can present data however you like, as long as it does those key things. It brings data to life. It helps the audience to interpret it. And I guess most importantly, it helps them gain an insight that perhaps they wouldn't have been able to gain from just looking at that raw data. So I talked about in that unit, we talk about Jon Snow with the dots. We also talk about the Mignard example. But I'd hope what they get from that is also understand that visualizations can take different forms, understanding that maybe even your sat nav that shows you a route from A to B, that's a visualization. The London Underground map is a visualization.
And I guess in a way, I mean, you could consider like a simple table of visualization, right? Because I think if you're if you're taking some raw data and you're aggregating it or you're summarizing it, that in itself is a simple form of visualization. It's not as pretty and as creative and as innovative as some of the visualizations that we're perhaps talking about. But I guess what's going on there is it's abstracting some of the detail away from the data and bringing to the surface the important, relevant things and making that more accessible to consumers of that data.
I think the key as well is when we're looking at these and we want to make this relevant to learners, if it's very different to look at a table compared to something amazing like those Jon Snow examples or the dance and things like that. It brings it to life and it makes it more appealing to our learners. It makes it more exciting. So I think moving towards sort of more of these sort of impressive visualizations is going to help our learners become more engaged with the materials.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. I mean, I talked about two historical examples, and history interests me, but it might not interest all the students. So you're absolutely right, Rebecca. It's about looking at this broad range of things. I mean, visualizations don't also have to be these static things on a page either. Still images on a website. They might be animations or perhaps showing how something changes over time, or it might be interactive where the audience get to explore the data that they want to. And going into the unit that's on there, there's a really good website called Gapminder where you can see how countries have progressed throughout time. So you can get students to pick something that interests them. For example, in that unit, I get them to think about where would be the best country in the world to live, and think about what would make that a good country. So they're getting to come up with a country name. It might be Barbados or somewhere fantastic like that. And I think on a rainy day like today, I'd definitely like to be in Barbados. But then getting them to think about, what data is available to them and how could you visualize that to prove your point, prove the fact that Barbados is the best place to live. And they can explore extra things like, employment rates, life expectancy, how much crime there is in these places to see whether or not they were right, And so in a way that interactive visualization, something very visual, it moves throughout time. So it can show you what that country was like in 1900 compared to 2021. So yeah, it's finding those other ways that can, appeal to them, I suppose, other than my historical examples.
I was playing with a tool the other day that I found, and there's a number of tools out there like this, but it sucked half a day of my time because it was just really interesting. So a website that I've been using recently called AnyChart, and there's loads of tools out there like this where you can program your visualizations using a JavaScript-based sort of thing. So you put your data in a data structure, you write some code, and it uses some classes of the API to render some really interesting and engaging visualizations that are also interactive. And so that's a really great way of combining other areas of computing with the data science areas as well. So let's bring Simon back in now and ask both Ben and Simon, for those educators that are maybe hearing this conversation that we're having and are slightly apprehensive or nervous, where can they go to start to learn a bit more about data science, build their confidence? What are the first steps that educators can take? Let's go to Simon first. Simon, what are your thoughts?
So obviously go to the National Computing Resources. As Ben alluded to earlier, there is a whole curriculum and series of lesson plans on data science. I'll definitely check out the Jon Snow example. Is one of my favourites too. The thing I like about that as well is it also teaches computational thinking skills. So things like pattern recognition, so you're trying to identify patterns to identify the problem. Also decomposition, so you're trying to break down the problem. It also introduces abstraction. So if you get access to some of the testimonies by some of the local people, then that helps you to come to the conclusion that it's water that's causing the the cholera. And by taking out the key points from all those testimonies and using abstraction, and then of course at the end you're using algorithm design to come up with a solution. I often make it gamified and come up with a competition to see who can come up with the best solution, and almost like Dragon's Den pitch. And we get some interesting ideas, including like sealing off the entire city. Definitely start with those resources. Also as well, Intel have created a free bank of resources called Intel SFI. And there's over 70 lesson plans cross-curricular that introduce the idea of computational thinking and data science and data analytics as well.
That's really good. There's some really good ideas there, Simon. Thank you. And Ben, what did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I agree with Simon, really. Don't be afraid to just go and explore something and give it a go. And really, don't let anything be a barrier to just giving it a go in the classroom. I mean, the chances are you've already, as we mentioned earlier, data science encompasses so many areas of the curriculum. The chances are, you look at the resources that are out there, you probably will be comfortable in delivering them. I mean, the Teach Computing curriculum, for example, we got a whole unit on it, as Simon mentioned, but, also come with, fully resourced with lesson plans that describe exactly what you need to do at what stage. So, you feel comfortable about that too. I think Data Education in Schools is a project based up in Scotland, funded by the Scottish Government. Their website is definitely worth checking out because whilst we've got some units on data science and Teach Computing curriculum, they focus specifically on data science, and they have a full range of resources, I think from 5 to 16. So I'd highly recommend looking at their work. I mean, Obviously, the most recent edition of Hello World magazine has some really great lesson ideas in it, some thought-provoking conversations around data science. And actually, if you're interested in exploring like the programming side of data science, there's a free open source Python library called Pandas, and you can use that to prepare data as well as analyze it and visualize it. So there's lots of resources online for that, but we've also got an article in there which has got a really friendly beginner's tutorial on how to get started with it. So I'd look at that. So yeah, there's some really good stuff out there basically. So my advice would be to just spend a little bit of time looking at what lessons there are out there and you make any tutorials, but just don't be afraid to just give it a go with your classes.
So there's been a lot of talk recently about having a culturally responsive curriculum, and the Raspberry Pi Foundation has just released a report on this, giving guidance to educators about it. How do you think we can make data science more culturally responsive and relevant to our learners?
So I think as a teacher of data science, I really want to excite the students by making them realize that this isn't just like a theoretical skill that they learned in a lesson and they're never going to use again, which is, of course, the case with all of our lessons. But I'd want students to think about how they can apply these skills to, bring about change on something that matters to them in their lives. And this is kind of goes back to what Simon was talking about, the culturally, relevant curriculum. I don't think it should be, or arguably it definitely shouldn't be something that's decided by the teacher, but it's moving them onto a project, like I say, that provides something that's relevant to them. They feel that they can use those skills to make a change. For example, let's say in school, litter really bothered me. So rather than going to the head teacher and saying, I think there's a problem and what you're going to do about it, I could actually go and gather some data about where the litter is, where the bins are, what type of litter is being dropped. And maybe if I visualize that and analyze the data, that might provide me with insights such as maybe there was lots of litter being dropped in the languages corridor and it turns out there was no bin within 50 meters of that area. Now what I can do is I can highlight the issue to the head teacher, but rather than just be a moan, I can make a suggestion on how things can be improved. And the great thing is it's all backed up by data. So it's not my opinion anymore. So I'm sure many teachers listening to this might think, well, my students aren't that interested in litter. But the principle of that idea of them being able to investigate something like this, but actually something that's relevant to them, what you're doing is you're empowering them to use their data science skills that you've taught them to gain a better understanding about something that matters to them, maybe something that makes a difference that they could use to hopefully bring about change. And that might be something simple, like, how much water they consumed a week or something, because they think they might need to drink more water. They can investigate that. They might look at their mobile phone usage and what apps they're using, what time of the day. And, that might bring about change in their own lives. But they might also look at local data sets, something that's, about traffic in their local area. There's so many possibilities that you can customize their learning to something that matters to them, something that really interests them. And that doesn't have to be the same for every student in the classroom. It might be completely tailored and individualized to whatever matters to them, really.
That's great. I think that relates back to this sort of conversation where we started with Simon talking about context. I think when we are selecting context for our learners. I think it's really important, and this is one of the things from the culturally relevant guidance is understanding your learners, knowing what they're interested in and being able to kind of, guide them towards things that interest and motivate them. Well, thank you very much, both of you. We asked you, our audience, for your thoughts via social media on what data science looks like in your setting. What do students learn about and how do you introduce them to it?
Yeah, so Ms. Denick has said at their school they have a rich offer, including visualizing data sets within open processing and statistical analysis with R. Not sure what that is, but it'd be interesting to find out. They also have a dedicated extracurricular course in the topic. Ms. Denick says that these measures have supported students' entry into both apprenticeships and university courses in the area.
That's fantastic. R it's a language that I'm aware of, but I've never really kind of been able to tinker with. It's specifically for doing data manipulation. So Shashi Krishna, who's a regular contributor to the podcast, talks about their experience at International Baccalaureate level, or IB. They've been looking into genetic algorithms this year, and they've also been using Data Studio to extrapolate knowledge and meaning from the raw, unstructured data sets. It is very much ongoing work, but I think it sounds like a really exciting and interesting route.
Yeah, Matthew Wimperney Smith says how data is processed into information by adding meaning to it. So it could be as simple as labeling it and then displaying in a meaningful way that is accessible to its intended audience, or such as infographics or simple chart, how to collect, organise and read data so that it can be understood in its context.
And I'm really grateful to Kat Lamin for sharing a primary perspective, so some slightly younger learners. I think for her personal view is that she finds it quite a tough area of the curriculum for her. But I think a recent realisation has been that it isn't just sort of death by Excel and boring spreadsheets. There is a lot of value in this area. But for primary, there's a lot of focus on recognising the value of data, how it's used to inform decisions. And they do a lot of work on collecting and manipulating data and understanding how that works. And I think in that regard, it's quite linked to the maths curriculum as well. My thanks to Simon Johnson and Ben Garside for sharing their expertise with us today and also sharing their experience of teaching data science. You can read their articles on this topic in issue 16 of Hello World magazine. If you have a question for us or a comment about our discussion today, then you can email via podcast@helloworld.cc, or you can tweet us at helloworld_edu. So, Rebecca, what did we learn today?
Well, I've learned what R is now, so maybe I can go investigate that further. And I've also learned quite a few more ideas for data visualization, which is really useful. And I definitely want to read that book that you mentioned at the beginning called Information is Beautiful. So I think that's going to be added to my reading list.
And on my part, apart from knowing that Jon Snow is not just in Game of Thrones, I'm really interested to go and find out a bit more about his early work in data visualization.